All right, continuing with chapter 10, Blaxploitation, spelled BLAX, exploitation, was very popular in the early 70s. This was again on the heels of what we had been talking about the end of the last session about the urban blight and the urban decay of the early 70s that disproportionately impacted African Americans and people who lived in poverty. Again, the people who could afford to leave the cities did. So the blaxploitation was a movement in the early 70s of movies, of music that sort of highlighted, often glamorized, the life of drugs and crime and prostitution and unemployment and poverty and the breakdown of the family system. Uh, and featured casts of either predominantly or exclusively African American actors. And they played to a variety of audiences. It wasn't just a black experience. White audiences went to see the movies. I mean, most prominent among the exploitation films that sort of rose up were Shaft and Superfly, and they weren't blaxploitation in the classic sense, but they did sort of focus on those issues. And white audiences, frankly, went to these films and then generalized that everyone who wasn't white lived like this and felt like this and thought like this and acted like this. And it frankly, it did absolutely nothing to bring groups of folks together. It further exacerbated problems of racial disparity and perception and stereotyping and all that stuff. Anyway, musically, Shaft and Superfly in particular both gave us great soundtracks. And Shaft was actually the bigger hit, but the theme from Shaft. But Superfly produced some great music by a guy named Curtis Mayfield, who would work with Aretha Franklin, among others. Curtis Mayfield gave us some great stuff from the Superfly soundtrack. One of the cuts that was a hit on the radio called Freddie's Dead, Curtis Mayfield. That style of music, the rhythm and blues that was had a very strong funk background, emanated from the likes of James Brown, and then the Sly and the Family Stone brought it on in the early 70s. It was very prominent and would lead, at least in part, to disco music that was going to come later on in the decade. All right, now we're up to Charley Pride. I love Charley Pride. Um, let's listen to Charley Pride's biggest hit on the pop chart. Charley Pride was an amazing country and western artist, but his biggest hit on the pop chart was called Kiss an Angel Good Morning. Kiss an Angel Good Morning, Charley Pride. Uh, Charley Pride was a great country artist. He also happened to be black, and most country artists are not. In fact, Charley Pride remains now, 50 years later, the most prominent African American artist in country music history, and a great musician as well, Charley Pride. Elvis Presley, king of the 50s, still hung around during the 60s, was a hugely popular artist during the 60s. Less of a thing than he had been in the 50s, but still a big deal. 1970s came and Elvis's career was waning, but he had one more burst left in him. Burnin' Love was released in 1972 and would go up the chart all the way to number 2 and become the last of Elvis Presley's 36 top 10 hits. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Burning Love. Okay, 72. We're up now to what would come to be called Southern rock, would also come to be called swamp rock, and it was great music. It was great music. This was music from bands. It was guitar based. It pulled a lot of influence from country music, pulled a lot of influence from folk music, um, just gave us some straight up rock and roll. And Creedence Clearwater Revival was a band who came around in the late 60s, and they were sort of at the forefront of the movement, but other bands would come and sort of rise to Creedence's level of popularity, at least in the world of Southern rock. And they would also gain some notoriety in part for the tragedies that followed them. Both the Allman Brothers Band and Lynyrd Skynyrd would suffer tragedies of losing members in plane crash and motorcycle accidents. But the music they made was great. It was just straight up rock and roll at its finest. The Allman Brothers, we start with a hugely popular record from 72 called Ramblin' Man. It's great stuff. Allman Brothers. And the Allman Brothers would go on for years and years and years as a prominent fixture of Southern rock and roll. Creedence Clearwater Revival, from about 1968 on, they were hugely popular all over the radio in the United States. From 68 until about 72, 73, this was kind of their last hurrah in a lot of ways. Looking Out My Back Door is one of the great Creedence songs that really fits into the Southern rock idea. Listen. Okay. Creedence Clearwater Revival. Good stuff. Lynyrd Skynyrd, another terrific band out of northern Florida, named themselves, I believe, after their gym teacher. Not that his name was Lynyrd Skynyrd, but his name was Leonard Skenyard or something. Anyway, a little bit of trivia for you. But Sweet Home Alabama, I mean, come on. As an amalgamation of rock music and country music and, sort of guitar rock and um, the sort of bar rock, the like we talked about rhythm and blues music as being associated with juke joints, back in the hills, kind of let's go back and uh, do some illegal activity out of the sight of the law. Well, Lynyrd Skynyrd was one of those bands that you just, they got played in bars and it was that style of music and they never felt bigger than that somehow, and yet they always felt big. I don't know if that makes any sense, but Sweet Home Alabama is just, I don't know. It's a great song. You can't talk about the history of rock and roll. I got all upset. You can't talk about the history of rock and roll and not talk about Sweet Home Alabama. Lynyrd Skynyrd. Turn it up. Or to you it'd be turn it up. Great tune. It's a great tune. Okay. And today, finishing up with the Eagles. The Eagles would go on to be one of the most successful bands in rock history, certainly one of the most successful American bands. The Eagles, from, we're at 72, By 74, the Eagles from 1974 into the 1980s monopolized the charts. Those were the days of One of These Nights and Hotel California, um, Life in the Fast Lane, and The Long Run. I mean, great Eagles music, little of which we'll be able to listen to later. But in 1972, the Eagles were just getting started. And they had gotten started originally in the late 60s by actually being the backup band for a great singer called Linda Ronstadt. Linda Ronstadt, if you're familiar, is one of the terrific female vocalists in rock history. And the Eagles were her backup band. They sort of stepped out into their own, developed their own sound, their own flavor. The Eagles would go on to become much more mainstream and um, much more sort of straight ahead rock and roll in a lot of ways. But when they started, they were of that kind of Southern rock vein, that combination, that intersection of rock and roll, guitar rock, country, and a little bit of folk. And the best representation for this, the first top 10 hit the Eagles had from 72, Take It Easy. The song that put Winslow, Arizona on the map, at least on the map, outside of Winslow, Arizona. I'm sure they were always on their own map. All right, take it easy. That's the message for the day. Please do so, and I'll see you next time around. Have a good one.